Welcome, school leaders, to this really important training session. This session is created to equip you with the toolkit, yes, a toolkit that leads you into the process of creating a remote and blended teaching and learning plan. This training session has been brought to you by the Office of Education Quality Assurance and supported by Holistic Business Solutions and Global School Leaders. It is extremely important that as a school leader, you understand exactly how to transition from the process of emergency teaching and into creating a remote and blended teaching and learning plan. Yes, the pandemic seems like it is going away. But more than the pandemic, beyond the pandemic, there were a lot of other things that actually caused disruption to teaching, disruption to learning, and led to out of school children. One of such is insurgency. Another is natural disasters. And then, of course, we had riots. And so there was just so much more than the pandemic that caused the disruption in our learning, which is why the OEQA has put together this training. It is for every and any school leader who wishes to create a sustainable learning plan for their school. When you think about disruptions and the out of school children, the learning losses and learning gaps, you begin to understand that we cannot always have fire brigade approach to things. No, we must think sustainability, and that is what this plan is about. When you go through all the four modules, all the four sessions, and you begin to dig really deeply into the toolkit that will be given to you, you are so well equipped, first of all, to train your teachers, to train and develop your learners, and of course, your parents, such that at the end of this session, your school would come out as a really strong school, especially when you begin to implement all of the things that have been provided for you. Once again, welcome to this training session, and I am excited to be your facilitator. Thank you to the Office of Education Quality Assurance for putting this together, not just for schools in Lagos State, but for schools globally. Let's get into it. It's been really interesting that when COVID-19 happened, not a lot of people folded their arms and just did nothing. People swung into very quickly, I might add, creating systems, creating mechanisms to ensure that children kept learning. I mean, I heard of so many schools who quickly went on to the platforms like Google Classroom, Edmodo, WhatsApp. I mean, people started to put together learning packets, but it was done in a hurry, right? It was done in an emergency situation. It was done just, it was like a rush job. We cannot keep doing things on a rush job. We need to begin to move away from these short-term planning strategies that we have employed to date and move into a long-term planning strategy. And that is what this toolkit is meant to do for you. And so you would notice that we have three instances that we need to look at, three things that we need to get a crack on, starting with the short term and then moving towards the long-term success of the school, right? So the first thing is we are in the short term right now, okay, but we cannot stay in the short term. So what do we need to begin to do right now in terms of long-term planning, right? It's not just, like I said, about the crisis that COVID-19 brought. It's just thinking and looking ahead and saying, what if we had another riot? What if insurgency became such a big deal? What if, due to global warming, natural disasters become something that are right here amongst us? Are we going to just keep schools shut? Or are we going to be able to sustain learning using these fire brigade approaches? It is not likely. So we must begin to think about long-term planning in response to school closures, in response to disruptions in the education sector. The second thing that we need to look at is the fact that we were great, and I would say it over and over again, in reacting so quickly, honestly, without a lot of time to plan, because the students were in school, learning was still going on, but we needed to close schools and ensure that learning continued. So it was great that we had such a quick response time, but can we build on that response time and now begin to be very intentional about the long term? How can we begin to develop a thought out long term plan? And that's the purpose for this toolkit, right? It's not just about these emergency situations, it's about being purposeful, being intentional to say, you know what, this is what we are faced with, and this is what we could be faced with. And so this is the plan that we have in place, which we activate as needed to ensure that learning keeps happening in school, out of school, or via a blended learning format. All right, so that's the second thing that we need to begin to think about. The third and final thing that we need to think about is, what are we going to do right now to address learning? Right, knowing that looking at what we're currently doing has far-reaching implications for the long-term success of our schools. So it's not just to say, let's continue. No, we say let's continue, but it's not just about doing it. It's not just about the short-term engagements. No, it's saying, what are the things that we're doing right now that could become a problem potentially and lead to children falling back even by one grade level? So we must think very thoroughly about the strategies that we're putting in place to ensure that top learning outcomes are being embedded even into our short-term and, of course, long-term strategies. So these three are things that we need to begin to think about very deliberately, even as we begin to create a framework for long-term plans for teaching and remote learning in our schools. How do you go about using this toolkit? It's a question that we need to answer at this time. The first thing is that you need to begin to think and ask yourself, what are the things I must consider for the long term, and what are the things I need to take a look at that we have already instituted in this short term? So first step, schedule a staff meeting with your teachers. And what are you discussing? How has it been? How has it been, and how was it when we had to do purely emergency remote teaching? What has it been now that we've been doing it for a bit of time? And what are the things that we need to begin to think about and plan for the long term? That's the very first thing that you need to do. But as a school leader, you're not just coming with a blank slate, right? No, because you've had maybe parents call you and talk to you about some things. Maybe teachers complain about some certain things to you as well. So you need to begin to pull back all of these things that has come to your notice, of course, and blend it with the teachers as you begin to discuss the plans for going ahead. All right, so once again, you need to schedule a staff meeting with your teachers to discuss what you're going to do in terms of remote teaching and learning, right? And it's extremely important that you're not just planning ahead, but that you're looking at your current situation and bringing it in and saying, what can we do to ensure that the learnings that we've had so far are considerations even as we begin to think about a long-term plan. The second thing you need to think about is to think about the different, and there are a lot, different aspects that are related to remote teaching and learning, because you must consider all of these aspects before you develop a plan. Again, this is something that you do in that same staff meeting. So you might want to schedule maybe 2 staff meetings, one to take a look at where you're coming from and what you need to engage in, the things that you need to maybe tweak, the things you need to add, the things you need to remove. So that might be one staff meeting. Your second staff meeting, you're then looking at it and saying, what are the different aspects? Who are the different people? What are the different subjects that we need to begin to think about? How about learning in the labs, right? All of these are different aspects for learning that need to be considered. Okay, how about the use of technology? How about the learning packets? How about reaching out to the parents? How about feedback processes? All of these are aspects, and you need to begin to write them down and begin to think very deeply about all of these things. And yes, we do have resources for you. Even as you go ahead on this training, you will begin to see some of these resources in this session and in the other sessions that you will take part in as we go along. But you must think about it and say, before I can go ahead, right, I must think about where I am now with a view to going ahead. As we go ahead, one thing that we thought was really important is to provide clarity with regards to a lot of terms that have been flying around. Some of these have been used correctly, some maybe not so correctly. Some have been contextual in terms of wrong context of usage, but we're going to clarify it. And we have broken down these into 3 parts. Part A is teaching during emergencies. What do we really mean by teaching during emergencies? Is it the same thing as remote teaching? Is it the same thing as blended teaching? We will clarify. The second part that we're going to look at in terms of the categories that we have created to just make remote teaching and learning clear and blended teaching and learning clear, is what exactly is remote teaching and learning. We will unpack this and move you into a space of full understanding of that particular terminology. The third part, which is part C, is again taking a look at blended teaching and learning. What exactly is it? How should it be approached? What are the expectations for all stakeholders? These three parts is what we're going to get into even as we move along in the session. And remember, the point is not to correct you, no. The point is to provide a solid foundation for you to have even as you move into the periods of planning. Planning for a strong mechanism that carries our schools through, regardless of what might happen, regardless of what disruptions might be just around the corner. Part A, teaching during emergencies. What exactly do we mean when we say we're teaching during emergencies? You will recall that immediately a message went out that schools should be shut. Everybody seems to just start to run around in circles, pulling textbooks, pulling learning materials, recording quick videos. I mean, everything, there was almost like an upheaval. There was a lot of sourcing on YouTube. There was all sorts that was going on to just ensure that while the children were at home, learning could keep happening. That is emergency teaching. It is very different from online teaching because when you look at online teaching, there is a more planned approach to it. All right. So in an emergency, you're not really thinking about planning. You're thinking of short term. What do I need to do right now to make this work? Right. So just imagine that you woke up in the morning and you needed to take a bath and there was no water. The water wasn't flowing. What you would do is begin to look around for something to quickly put in place. Maybe it was raining. You might take your bucket outside and just get a bit of water. Maybe you would look into the bottles that you have in your home. So you are looking for something on the short term, a quick fix approach. That is emergency teaching. It is very different once again from online teaching because it is quick, right? And that really is what we have been experiencing. But we need to understand what we have been experiencing in terms of emergency teaching such that when we begin to plan for online teaching, we have a better understanding of what needs to be done. Number two, it is temporal. Emergency teaching is not something that you should engage in long term because it is not sustainable. We cannot keep running around and praying that it rains because we don't have water. We cannot keep using drinking water to take a bath, to wash clothes, to do other things simply because we did it once. No, as we did it once, when we go out of our homes, what do? We either get a tanker, a water tanker, or we go and take a look at the pipes and say, oh, there, Mr. Plumber, can you please come and take a look at my pipes? I'm having a problem with this. And that's because you want to move from the temporal situation, which led to an emergency approach, into a more sustainable long-term approach. That is where we are going. And that moves us to number three. We need to begin right now, think about a long-term plan. This focuses, more on mastery. In the short term, what we are doing right now is focusing on engagement, right? Let's just do this. Let's just ensure those are the kind of terminologies that you would be using and you would hear floating around in your schools and in the educational sector. But it cannot be like that forever. So we need to begin to move, right? Very strategically, very intentionally into the long-term plans. But right now on the short term, that's okay. We are in an emergency situation, and so we are being responsive in the best way possible. But let us not forget that we need to begin to move from the place of engagement, short term, to the place of mastery on the long term. So this is a resource for you, dear school leader. And what you need to begin to think about as you look at this resource and you begin to think of how you're going to use this resource is to say, how do I move from short-term planning to long-term planning? And you would notice on this sheet that we do have it written there, short-term goals, long-term goals. The use of technology, once again, on the short term versus all the information that you need to ensure that the use of technology transcends from the short term and becomes more purposeful in the long term. And then you're thinking of your routines in the short term. How can I make this happen in the homes, on the online platforms? That's what you're thinking. But on the long term, you're thinking more of an empowerment solution. How do I begin to empower my teams to move into that space where they're fully equipped with all that they need to do to ensure that these short-term routines become a long-term way of teaching and learning for our community? And then, of course, you cannot underemphasize the importance of community participation. It just cannot be done. You must begin to think and say to yourself, what is the role of every single family in my school? How do I ensure that not just my teachers are equipped, but my students are equipped? If you think about your school system, permit me to do a bit of drawing. When you think about your school system, right, this is the school system. All of this area is the school system. Embedded within the school system, you have your teachers, you have you, the school leader, and you have learning, right? And you also have what? The school teachers. And so you must begin to think about what? These are what? Your teachers. Let's mark that as a T. This is your community, made up of what? Your students and your parents. You must think about you, the school leader, and then you must think about the learning that needs to happen. These four components are extremely important in a school system. Now, what are you trying to do? You're trying to ensure that your teachers are providing the right learning resources for your students, and you, the school leader, you are supporting this entire system to make sure that you're creating the policies to make it happen. That is the way you need to begin to think about your school. That is how you need to begin to look at this resource. That is how you need to begin to plan for community participation. We're going to be looking at part B, which is really unpacking what remote teaching and learning entails, what it is about, and how you can begin to even think about the entire process when you consider that you need to begin to plan for it. Now, it is important that remote teaching is when the schools are closed. We need to all understand that. Everybody is at home, but learning is going on. So if maybe, for example, the pandemic, there's a huge riot going on, there's wanton destruction of property, safety becomes a problem, or there's a natural disaster, maybe heavy snowing or excessive flooding or the threat of hurricanes. It could be honestly anything, but this will necessitate in long periods of closures for schools. Then you must begin to think remote teaching. How do I ensure that my students keep learning, my teachers keep teaching whilst they're not in the classroom? All right, so that is when remote teaching happens. And you need to understand that when you talk about remote teaching, it happens, like I mentioned earlier, in the homes, in a location that is different from the school where they principally come. All right, so there's no interaction between the students and the teachers in person. Everything is happening remotely. There's really no FaceTime or anything like that. It is all done remotely. That is remote teaching. And it can be delivered synchronously using a synchronous format followed by asynchronous format. However, we need to understand that technology might not be something that is easily accessible to all the students. And so in that case, that means you have students falling through the cracks, right? So you must always think about your own context, right? What if you have teachers who do not even know how to use technology? What do you do? But in the case that you do have students who understand this, who can access the technology elements, then oh yes, please go ahead, and even in your remote teaching, you can embed a bit of synchronous learning, which is learning happening together at the same time. So everybody in the community or in a particular grade level, the teachers and the students come together at a set time, and then they can meet. And this can be done via Zoom call, Google Hangout, I beg your pardon, using Teams, even a WhatsApp session that is happening on the go and everybody's responding at the same time, or maybe using a Telegram platform as well, right? But it is happening at exactly the same time for everybody else. That's when it is synchronous, so it is synced. However, You can then embed asynchronous learning, which is follow-up learning. Maybe a teacher has recorded some videos, or has some packets that she's sending out to the students. So in the case where synchronous learning cannot happen, then you fall back very heavily on asynchronous learning formats. But what you need to understand is the fact that you must plan, how do I deliver this? How do I give feedback? So all of those things are what you want to begin to consider, especially because you must bring it within your context. It might all really sound nice and great and lovely, but if you think about it outside of your context and plan outside of your context, then it is a waste of time. So you must think about you as a school leader and your community and what they need. And that is how you can begin to create an effective remote teaching and learning plan for your school. I am extremely excited about this resource, because what it does is that it puts a lot of power in your hands. This is a resource that would guide you into creating remote teaching and learning as a school leader, all right, for your school. Now, the first thing, which is right here, is you must develop clear expectations, okay, and plans for the learning for the year. That's the first thing. If people do not understand the expectations, then they cannot meet the expectations. So it must be clear, all right. And the second thing is you must develop systems to monitor and track learner and teacher progress. So it's not just about the teaching now, it's also about the learning and the progress. So you must have a system that tracks it. You must. It's not just enough to set the expectations and everybody goes and starts planning. No. How are you going to make sure that it is happening? How do you make sure that it is happening consistently? That is extremely important. And then, of course, you must communicate plans and system to all team members. And there I say to all stakeholders. So it's not just now about your staff, your teachers. No, it's also about the community, the parents and the students. Because if it has been developed really nicely but not communicated, then I don't know my job as a parent. And when that happens, there will be so much dissonance within the system and nothing will really get done. None of these fantastic expectations will get met. None of the tools that we have put together to monitor and to deliver will get used appropriately. So you must communicate it very clearly, all right, such that everybody who is a stakeholder, who has a part to play, understands their part and can begin to play it, all right. So amongst developing clear expectations, these are very clearly written out for you. So with your teachers, remember, you cannot do this by yourself, so do not try to. Please do not try to. Do it with your teachers so that you are developing people along the way. You must think sustainability. You must think succession planning. So doing it with your teachers and embedding the community values is something that is extremely important. Now, if you look on this part, it says who, by when, and then specific notes that everybody needs to read up to just be on the same page, right? So it's almost making your thinking visible. So who is meant to do these particular things, right? You must assign responsibility. When do they need to get this done? There must be a timeline. If you have a plan without a timeline, it is open-ended and it will never be done, all right? Or it will be done shabbily because people will rush. And then what are the thinkings, your own expectations regarding this, right? Sometimes we feel that we have communicated as school leaders and we have not, because nobody quite can look into our head and pull out what we are thinking. So you must be very clear and write exactly what it is that you want to see in terms of developing expectations, all right. And the same goes for the system. So what is the mechanism that you have in place for tracking what the learners are doing and what the teachers are doing? Is there somewhere they need to comment on when they are done? How do you set expectations for your teachers for attendance, for example? How about the amount of time the students should be spending doing this work, right? How are you checking it? Okay, how do you use again, maybe a technology tool to track progress and track the process of what is going on both at home and with your teachers? And then of course you must have these protocols designed, all right. So you're checking what are the challenges they're having, how can you monitor the progress of all of the things that you have put in place, and how can you give quick feedback such that there's an agile reiterative method to put things in place when things need to be done quickly, and it's not tied up with bottlenecks, which leads to even further losses in learning for the students. And then of course communication, all right. So it's really important that you share updates regarding both expectations and the roles people should play with the learners, the teachers, and their families. It's very clear that you state it, and you still state it Who is going to send this update? When are they going to send the update? What should people do as a result of the updates? What, those are the kind of things that maybe you want to put in your notes, right? And I mean, just spending time with this toolkit and speaking with your teachers and just getting to understand what everybody needs to be doing is one very strong way to begin this entire process of creating a remote plan for your school. Welcome back. So this is the third part, all right? Remember we talked about the fact that we have three parts to this, and this is part 3. So in this part, we're looking at blended teaching and learning. What is blended teaching and learning exactly? So let's unpack the word blended, because I think we all kind of understand what teaching and learning is. So let's look at the word blended. To blend means a mix. So what are we mixing? That's the quick question. So we are mixing remote learning and in-class learning. So this, when you think about a blended teaching and learning model, then it's something that you can institute. It's something that you can implement if maybe your school can be open a few days a week. So maybe you are running shifts or you have groups who come in at certain times of the week, then you can use this particular tool, this particular plan, this particular model in your school. All right, so that is blended teaching and learning plan. It is when there's a mix of remote and in-person teaching and learning. Okay, that's when you have blended teaching and learning plan. Once again, it means that your teachers and your students can be in school for parts of the week, but not for every day of the week. Okay, so it's blended. So there's a part for home and there's a part for school. That's how you need to begin to think about it. All right, and I hope that I was able to make that clear. What that means is that and so that's going to number 2 now. You have limited time with the students, right? There's limited synchronous learning time in person with your students. So you are now thinking, what are we going to do to ensure that the rest of the learning that needs to happen happens at home? Okay, so again, that's the remote elements that you are embedding into the teaching and learning plan. So you must be very clear exactly what am I going to do when the children are in school? What are they going to do when they're at home? Right? That's extremely important. And when they're in school, you must have clear guides, right? Is that the time where you're going to deliver a new concept, for example? Is that the time where you want the students to do work in the laboratory, for example? Is that the time where you want to see the students can walk by themselves, for example? These must be clearly stated. And in the very next slide, there is another resource material which I would walk you through it on how to use it. But that is what happens in a blended teaching plan. There's very limited time because the students are not in school every day of the week, but you must maximize the time that they're in school so that you ensure that you set them up to continue working really smoothly and by themselves when they do are at home. Now, the third thing that you need to understand is the fact that it can actually be delivered synchronously and asynchronously. Okay, so what basically happens is you can decide to maybe front load their learning. So front load means you send it a content for them to learn either via video, or you put them on a website or a radio program or a TV program. So they kind of learned the concept, right? And that is front loading. Okay, so they get it first and then they come back to the classroom and then you practice with them. You are testing for understanding when they're with you in the classroom. And so what that means is that you are maximizing the time. So instead of starting all over from the beginning when they're with you in class, you've already given it to them. Right? So that's a really beautiful mixed model, right? And so they've learned it at home and then they come to school and then you get into it with them and you can determine, oh, who didn't get it? Why didn't they get it? And you can then begin to provide really intentional support for every single learner in your classroom. So we're going to go into the tool now and then I'll show you how to use it. And welcome back. So this toolkit, you might think that it's very similar to the one that you saw before for the remote teaching and learning. It is very similar, but it is not exactly the same. It's different, all right? And what makes it different is the function, which is as a result of the purpose for it, okay? So we're thinking purpose now when we're looking at this. And what you need to begin to think about in this particular session is, how do you develop the clear expectations based on what I said before? What will they do in school? What will they do at home? How will you do it in school? How will you do it at home? How will you track it in school? How do you track it at home? So those are the things that you're beginning to think about, okay? And then, of course, how do you communicate participation? So it's almost, once again, like a 3 part format. It starts with a plan, right? So what is your plan for school? And what is your plan for home? What is your plan in school for the teachers? What is your plan in school for the learners? What is your plan in school for the teachers, for the learners, and for the parents? Okay, and how do you track and monitor learning across these different areas? So that's what you're thinking about. So it's not just remotely now, you're doing it in both ways. And then you're looking at synchronous and asynchronous, and you're saying to yourself, what should I do synchronously? What do I need to do? What do you do asynchronously, and what do you do synchronously? How can you ensure that everybody who has access to this gets the best out of it? All right, and that's how you use this particular tool in creating a very clear pathway for blended learning in your classrooms. It is almost unbelievable that we have come to the end of this particular session. It has been so insightful. There's been so much learning. There's been so many resources that you have been given, so many skills that you have been equipped with. And it is exciting that we are at this point where we need to reflect, where we need to begin to think about all that we have learned and ask ourselves pertinent questions. What part of remote or blended teaching and learning is still a little unclear? What part is fuzzy? What part would you like to learn more about? That is a question you need to ask. That is a question you need to have answered. And once again, the Office of Education Quality Assurance is waiting for your questions. They are waiting for your feedback so that they can give you the support that you need. So don't keep it to yourself. Don't imagine that you're going to be graded downwards. No, they are a support system for you. And so please reach out and ask for the support that you need. So think again, once again, with all these things that I have learned, what part of remote and blended teaching and learning is unclear? What part do I need help with? What part do I see potentially could be a challenge? You need to find out. And then, of course, you need to start to ask yourself, how can you introduce and discuss these ideas with your teachers, right? You don't just jump in and say, it's time, this is something that you need to do. No, there has to be a transition process. How do you move them into that transition process? How do you explain all that they need to learn, all that they need to be doing, how they need to be connecting with the students, the learners, the parents, everything? How do you begin that process? How about connecting with other teachers as well? You need to begin to put together a plan for introducing this thing and discussing these ideas with your teachers. It is extremely important. And finally, what is that one, maybe tiny step that you can take today? That right now you can say, you know what, I can do this. And then you begin to do it. If you don't start, you're never going to complete it. And so you must take that step, no matter how small it is, to begin planning for remote teaching and learning. You must say to yourself, this is important and I am going to do this. I cannot wait to hear all the amazing things that you're going to do as a result of taking this module. I'll see you in the next class.